My name is James Robson, and I'm the director of the Harvard Asia Center and a professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. And it's really my distinct pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Asia Center and also the Kim Koo Forum on U.S. Korea Relations at the Korea Institute at Harvard to this evening's very special event. This is the 2019 Psy Lecture, which is the 15th since its inception in 2006. And it will be delivered, as you know, by the Honorable Kathleen Stevens, the former U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2008 to 2011, and also the current President and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America. The Tsai Lecture is always, I think, one of the highlights of the Asia Center's academic year among many of the special events that we put on. The Tsai Lecture was established thanks to a generous gift from Felix Tsai, for whom this auditorium is also named. And the Tsai Lecture brings notable academics, government officials, business leaders, and other specialists in the fields to Harvard to give a public lecture. The first Tsai Lecture was given in 2006 by Wang Gongwu, director of East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore, and has included notables such as Amitav Ghosh, Jim Yong Kim, the president of the World Bank, and most recently, the Honorable Carolyn Kennedy, the U.S. ambassador to Japan from 2013 to 2017. Incidentally, I should also add, I think that these two ambassadors this evening and also Honorable Carolyn Kennedy were the first female ambassadors in their respective countries. I think that's correct, of Japan and Korea. So let me take this opportunity to also recognize my predecessor at the Asia Center, Professor Karen Thornber, under whose leadership the planning for tonight's lecture began, and also to express my appreciation to the wonderful and dedicated staff of the Asia Center and to the Korea Institute for the work that they've done to make this evening possible. Following the lecture, please stay around and join us for a reception that'll take place in the Concourse outside here at about 6 p.m. Tonight's speaker will be formally introduced by my colleague, Professor Sunju Kim, who is the Harvard-Yenching Professor of Korean History in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations and the current director of the Korea Institute. She is a distinguished scholar of Choson period social and cultural history who has published widely on the regional history of Korea and the everyday lives of people. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sunju Kim to the podium to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is a great honor for me to be able to introduce Ambassador Kathleen Stevens today. She is currently President and CEO of Korea Economic Institute of America, 한미경제연구소, based in Washington, D.C. KEI, according to its website, is the premier U.S. think tank and public outreach organization solely dedicated to helping Americans understand the breadth and importance of Korea and U.S.-Korea relations. Ambassador Stevens was a career diplomat in the United States Foreign Service for almost 40 years, beginning in 1975, retiring officially, I guess, in 2015. One of the highlights of her career was her appointment as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea, as James just mentioned, from 2008 to 2011. She was, again, the first woman and first Korean speaker to serve in that position. Other overseas assignments included positions to India, China, former Yugoslavia, Portugal, and Northern Ireland, where she was U.S. Consul General in Belfast during the negotiations culminating in the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Ambassador Stevens also served in a number of policy positions in D.C. At the State Department and the White House. These included acting Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs in 2012, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2005 to 7, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs from 2003 to 5, and National Security Council Director for European Affairs at the Clinton White House. Ambassador Stevens also have had close ties with academic institutions, facilitating engagements between academics and practitioners. She was William Perry Fellow for Korea at Stanford University's Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center from 2015 to 18. She has also been endowed chair professor for language and diplomacy at Hanguk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul, and senior State Department fellow at Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. Ambassador Stevens is a recipient of numerous U.S. government awards, including the Presidential Meritorious Service Award in 2009 and Linguist of the Year in 2010. Awards from Korea included the Kwanghwa Medal of Diplomatic Merit, the Sejong Cultural Award, and many, many others. She was also Hangul Goodwill Ambassador, as well as Korea National Museum Goodwill Ambassador. She holds honorary doctoral degrees from the University of Maryland and Chungnam National University in Korea. She was an undergraduate at Prescott College, as we just talked about, but also studied at University of Hong Kong and Oxford University. She holds a BA degree in honors from Prescott. She is also a Harvard alum, as she holds a master's degree from Harvard's Kennedy School. As you might have noticed already, Ambassador Stevens' ties with Korea has been long and deep. It began when she served in rural Korea, Chuncheon, if I'm correct, as a Peace Corps volunteer and trainer from 1975 to 1977. She was in Korea in 1983 to 89, first as a political officer at the U.S. Embassy in Korea, in Seoul, reporting on Korea's domestic, political, and human rights scene, and later leading the U.S. consulate in Busan. And this was one of the key moments in Korean democratization process. And I'm certain she has not only witnessed what went on in Korea, but also played an important role as one of the key diplomats there in Korea. And as mentioned, she served as U.S. ambassador to Korea from 2008 to 11. She is known to be the most beloved ambassador, not only because she speaks Korean very well and made public speeches in fluent Korean, but also because of her down-to-earth approaches in fulfilling her position. Rather than confining herself in the beautiful ambassadorial residence and office, she frequently went out and mingled with people. For example, as a bike mania, she biked from Seoul to Busan at one time. And in 2017, she also participated in a 7-day biking around the country. That's amazing. I believe that today she will share her wisdom and keen understanding of Korea and U.S.-Korea relations that she has been accumulating through many years of face-to-face engagements with the people of Korea and through her illustrious career to services to U.S. and the world as a career diplomat. So now, please join me with a round of applause to invite Ambassador Stevens to the podium.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. 안녕하십니까. Professor Kim, thank you, I think, for that very, very kind and generous introduction. I don't think I can really live up to that, but it's great to be here, and thank you. And Professor Robson, thank you so much. It's great to meet you. We discovered we have mutual friends who also went to Prescott College, so he's here to affirm it really does exist. And they had careers in Mongolia and Central Asia, so there you go. But that's another story. We can talk about that another time. It's really, really an honor to be here and to be invited to give this lecture. I have such admiration for, of course, for Harvard, but especially for the Asia Center, for the work that the center has done, that the Korea Institute in particular has done over the years. I'm a little bit intimidated, always when I come to Harvard, as a girl from Arizona, but I'm also intimidated because I see, and you mentioned some of the previous lecturers in this series, a great China expert who also happens to be a former Australian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister in that order, Kevin Rudd. I watched him on YouTube, and I think it was last year, and also, as you mentioned, Caroline Kennedy, who talked about her time as ambassador. So I don't think I can sort of live up to the glamour or the scholarship of those previous lectures, but I am very honored to be here, to be, I think, the first person you've had in this series to talk specifically about Korea. And I'll do my best, but I'll also try to leave some time for, I think I know about half of you in the audience, for a discussion where we can range wherever you'd like to go. Actually, this lecture hall feels quite familiar to me, even though I wasn't a student or a professor here. The first time I spoke here, I remember quite well. I think I do. I think it was Mark Twain or someone who once said, as I get older, I have increasingly vivid memories of things that never occurred. But I think I remember being here in 2006. The older people appreciate that joke. I remember being here in 2006 when I had one of those sort of mysterious titles from the State Department of being a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Pacific Affairs. You have to practice say that with one breath. I had actually come back to working on Asia. I wasn't really considered for many years an Asia specialist in the State Department. I spent about half my career working on post-Cold War European issues, but I was back working on Asia through, as the Koreans would say, 우연히, 어떻게 보니까. Somehow I ended up back on it, and I was here to give a talk under the auspices of the Kim-gu Forum. And I met Kim-gu's granddaughter. We were talking about her. She's a great friend of the Institute, and learned something about Kim-gu, of course, was a famous independence fighter, the head of the provisional government during the Japanese occupation, and based in China for much of that. And oh, it came up. So that's it. So the granddaughter is over there. This is actually, and when I met her first in this room, she said, I gave a talk, and she's this 2006. She said, well, if you ever get to Seoul, you have to come and see my grandfather's museum. And I'd never been there, so I said, well, yeah, I'd like to, but I have no plans to go to Seoul. I had no idea I was going to be ambassador to Korea at that time. But I did get to Seoul as ambassador, and so in 2009, I went there and met Kim-gu's son, Kim Shin, who's the next man over, and they presented me with this calligraphy. This is... if you hide the Hangul, if you don't, this is our Chinese character test for the day. But this is written in Kim-gu's handwriting. I've had some Koreans tell me it looks a little shaky, but he had a hard life, including a lot of injuries. And I'll cheat and use the Hangul below, but write Hanmi Chinsun Pyeongdong Hojo. And it was written and given to an American diplomat right before the establishment of the Republic of Korea, and then, of course, the DPRK. A very tumultuous, difficult time in Korean history, not the only one. And he was assassinated not long afterwards. And so the little test here is, what does this mean, right? Korean-American relations, Chinsun. I have too many scholars here. So friendship, right? Pyeongdong, equality, Hojo, cooperation. Is that a fair translation? Sounds unremarkable, but I've actually had many Koreans, when they look at it, say, wow, that's really kind of amazing that at this period in Korean history, and again, those of you know the history well, that this is something Kim-gu wrote and gave to an officer at the American embassy. So anyway, I was given this, but of course, as an American ambassador, you don't cart off the goods when you leave the country, and so if I can have the next slide. It now hangs. I hung it there. This is that beautiful residence, which is Korean style on a kind of a grander scale. Kind of think making a Korean hanok if you have very large Doug fir trees from the Northwest to build it with, and you have an idea of what this house is like. It's really quite wonderful. Sometimes the U.S. government does something right when it comes to architecture, and this is definitely one. But I hung that there in 2009, and this photo actually was taken fairly recently because it's still up. I'm very proud of that, and it's one of the first things that people see. Three ambassadors since me living in that house, but they've kept it up, and it's a conversation starter. You know, why did Kim Gu write that? You know, this was his aspiration for a U.S. Korea relationship. And many disappointments along the way, but something I think that still inspires us and that we think about. So I wanted to mention Kim Gu because of the sponsorship here and because of that. And I was also going to mention that that I was here, I think most recently in 2015 to mark the 10th anniversary of the Kim Gu Harvard Forum. And at that time, it was together, I think we sat on this stage together with then Ambassador Seoul Sung Kim, the first Korean American to be the U.S. ambassador in Seoul, and former ambassador and professor at Harvard, dean of the Fletcher School, Steve Bosworth. And I think Christine Bosworth is still in town, and we may see her a little bit later tonight, but we lost Steve too early. We miss him very much, and I can't not mention him here and all his contributions when I have the pleasure of coming back. So, I titled this lecture, The U.S. and Korea, An Unfinished Story. Now, I imagine for you professors there, tell me if I'm wrong, but if you had an undergrad, I should also say hello to the Consul General. Forgive me for not saying hello sooner. But I imagine if you professors had an undergraduate or a graduate student who said, oh, I'm going to write a paper and call it The U.S. and Korea, An Unfinished Story, you'd probably tell them what to be more specific, right? Or maybe if you said in Korean, you said it's a little childish, you know, 조금 유치하지. But I have some reasons for this title, and I'm going to tell you a couple of them. So when I first started reading about Asia as an undergraduate out there in Arizona, and then as I went on to Hong Kong and later to Britain, this of course is pre-internet, so books were very, very important. I think they're still important, by the way. But I had some key books, and you can probably guess what they were. They were written by John King Fairbank, Edwin Reischauer. There was, of course, the two great survey books, East Asia, The Great Tradition, and The Modern Transformation. And then there were the two books, one, the Fairbank book, The United States and China, and Reischauer, The United States and Japan. But as I was thinking about this may sound a little arrogant to me now, I thought, you know what? There's no book called The U.S. and Korea, I don't think, or The United States and Korea. There was probably, maybe Don Oberdorfer, who was a journalist, a longtime journalist in Asia for the Washington Post, wrote a book called The Two Koreas. It's probably the closest thing to kind of a survey book for the more general reader, but also for kind of an introductory course, if you like, about modern Korea, Korea's political history, its connections with the U.S. But I thought there's no book called The United States and Korea. Already this year, I've read, and I've actually had to review two of them, 3 biographies of Kim Jong-un, and he's not even in his 40s yet, and besides, we don't know much about him, but there are 3 books. But there's no book called The United States and Korea. So part of my logic is maybe somebody in this audience, or maybe one of your students, or maybe will want to write that book. It won't be me. I'm not a scholar. I was a diplomat, not quite 40 years, but I was a Peace Corps volunteer, but that wasn't, but for a long time, I was a practitioner, and I was, whether a Peace Corps volunteer or a diplomat, very reliant on the academy, on scholars, and those who in particular were able to reach out and beyond the academy with their expertise and their insights. You know, it's a fundamental precept of the career foreign service, and I have to say I've somehow, especially these days, I'm kind of proud to say that I was in the career foreign service. But it's always been a fundamental precept, and I think we've seen this in recent days, that good policy deliberation, good policy advice, good policy implementation has to be informed by context. And what do we mean by context? History, culture, language, relations, knowing something about the place. And you may think that's all blindingly obvious, but I have to say from my many years in the U.S. government and working in Washington in particular, sometimes it's not. There's a lot of people, I mean, even in the pre-internet age, who think that, it's not really that relevant, especially for a very powerful America. But we forget that importance. We ignore that at our peril. When we have, as a people, as a government, the United States, forgotten or ignored that the importance of expertise, of knowledge, of background, of history, we've gotten into some pretty calamitous situations, and we've made some pretty serious mistakes. I think of the China hands, the Foreign Service officers who served in China in the 1930s and the 1940s and reported back to Washington that unless Chiang Kai-shek gets a handle on corruption and starts fighting the Japanese, they're going to lose ground, notwithstanding American support. And Mao Zedong and his people look like they're going to be able to take power. So they reported what they saw, and they turned out they were right. And for that, many of them lost their jobs, and those who didn't lose their jobs were never allowed to work on China again because they were considered to be traitors, communists, or communist sympathizers. I could name others, times in Vietnam, Iraq, yes, even times in Korea, when clearly our policies have not been sufficiently informed. It doesn't stop you from making mistakes, informed by an understanding of the place in which we are working. And I guess watching current events in Washington unfold, I might add other parts of the world too, including Ukraine. But never mind. So whether it's called area studies, regional studies, I know those things maybe are a little out of fashion in parts of the academy. I don't know about Asian studies, specific disciplines. I don't know how to do academic speak very well, despite my visiting fellowships. I am here to say context, facts, expertise, they all matter. I think it's interdisciplinary, and it needs to continue to be taught and thought about in a holistic way. And as James and I were talking previously, a little dash of on-the-ground experience, whether that's just living and walking and talking, is not a bad thing either. Even in this day and age, this digital age, we're still flesh and blood, and I think that kind of experience really, really counts. So I've done a little bit of throat clearing here. I hope it doesn't sound like that. But I have to say, it's really hard to write talks for me these days. And I was thinking about being here in 2015, and speaking of context, the world context was so different. Here we are today, as I think about 2019. I don't work for the U.S. government anymore. I can say what I want. I'm very committed, as Professor Kim outlined, to the mission of the job I have now, which is to really try to deepen the understanding from the premise that the relationship with the United States and Korea is very, very important, and to me a very positive thing, and we need to make it better. But the old talking points don't quite work. There's a lot of noise around. I was talking to an Indian diplomat actually in Seoul recently who said, I just like the way he kind of put it. He said, we're living in a period of unprecedented, simultaneous global crises everywhere in the world. And certainly, I guess another way of putting that, we're in a period where the assumptions, the principles, the values, the institutions that underpin the post-World War II world order, sometimes called the international rules-based system or order, the kind of mental map framework that I worked on and supported and tried to strengthen as a diplomat through my time, all of that is under stress and attack and doubt. And most significantly in many ways, and ironically, or certainly most ironically, from within the United States itself, the country that shaped, led, and has arguably most benefited from that system. But that makes us think harder, certainly. That when fundamental assumptions also about democracy, about America's role in the world, about the value of our open trading systems, of the whole global economic order, all are being questioned as never before in my lifetime, and certainly as never before by an American president and an American institution. So what does that mean in a Korean context? Because we talk obviously a lot about the U.S.-China relationship. If you're sitting in Korea, what it means is, for me, every time I open my email, I'm being asked by a Korean journalist or invited to a panel to talk about questions that I thought were kind of settled questions. U.S. commitment to the Republic of Korea's defense, whether or not the U.S. can live with North Korean nuclear weapons, whether or not the U.S. will withdraw troops from South Korea in exchange for the abandonment of either nuclear weapons themselves, or let's just say intercontinental intercontinental missiles on the part of North Korea. All kinds of premises. I'm not, those every day it's filled with that, because it's that sense of subjects that were either, frankly, a little bit taboo, or just were thought to be outside the Overton window, outside of what you really considered to be logical, now are being asked. And in some ways, it worries me, but that's not a bad thing, because I think we all have to think about some of these underlying questions. It used to be just the Chinese who would long ago, for a long time, have been saying the U.S. South Korea alliance is a Cold War anachronism. Now we have a president who has, in the United States, who's suggested that maybe it is. Although, again, the pronouncements from the administration are mixed on that, shall we say. But I think there is a real question that I'm asked now is can the U.S., in this case South Korean alliance relationship, weather an era of China rising, America first, and Korea's own nationalist moment? Will South Korea have to do what we know it doesn't want to do? Choose big choices or small choices between China and the U.S.? And if so, what will it choose? Is that blood-forged alliance, one of the first words I learned in Korean, other than, give me water, is 혈맹관계, a relationship forged in blood from the Korean War and sacrifice. Is that a burden or a benefit to the United States? Will North Korea ever peacefully give up its nuclear weapons? Can the U.S. or the world live with a nuclear North Korea? And are we doing that already? Those are all the kinds of questions that I can't answer tonight. Because it really would be not just an unfinished story, but it'd be an unending lecture. But I do want to highlight a few thoughts that I hope will stimulate discussion now and going forward. And I guess to do that, having spoken about context, and also I guess I have to say about just a little bit of not exactly nostalgia, but a sense of the need to understand Korea's journey and the U.S. role in that, I want to say a little bit about the story so far. Now, we all know that in Korea and a lot of parts of East Asia, everyone likes to get a grade, how well have you done on something? So I was thinking, what if we were giving grades to U.S., and I'm thinking of U.S. policy in Korea? Now, this is a huge generalization, and all of this is huge generalizations. You can easily punch holes in it. But I would say that certainly in the United States, and also in Korea, there'd be a bipartisan consensus that South Korea's rise, the Republic of Korea, the economic, political, cultural blossoming that we have seen is, of course, first and foremost, the huge accomplishment of the South Korean people themselves, but the U.S. can also take, and does, considerable credit for its role in providing security, open markets, and with a continued engagement, which has certainly had its ups and downs, its misunderstandings and worse over time, but that has underpinned a success. And it's an alliance that has broadened and deepened over the years. So I'd give the U.S. a high grade on policy in South Korea. And also, I guess I'd back it up and say, when you look at South and North Korea, there's another thing that sometimes, and I'm going to repeat it here, said, some of you may have heard this about South and North Korea, being described as the largest real-life social science experiment in the world. That may sound a little bit clinical because we're talking about real people here and real suffering, so I don't want to think I'm being harsh about it. But if you think about the unplanned, if you like, or very unintended, but tended to be temporary division of Korea into two parts, and one part pursued a certain path and a certain system, and the other a whole set of others, and kind of see how they came out, given a population that as a fairly large and coherent nation state for a long time pursued these policies. It's an interesting experiment, and I think it's something that we can reflect upon, because when we think about North Korea has certainly been very successful in surviving and has shown tremendous resilience. Speaking of books that have been written about Korea, there's actually two books. One's called The Impossible State, and the other is called The Impossible Country. They're both, and one is about North Korea and one's about South Korea. They're by different authors, and I never remember which is which. But the point being that they're both very unlikely journeys. And I mean, journeys filled with resilience and suffering, and if you like, success in accomplishing certain goals. The challenge, I think, in North Korea is that the goal has been and remains, I think, one, the survival and the continuation of a regime, a dynasty now in its third generation, and also the consolidation of that regime and its legitimacy and its security through the pursuit of a nuclear weapons program that has now become quite consolidated. So from the point of view of, I guess, again, if I'm going to say from the United States point of view, one, clearly, there's been a big failure of our stated policies. I mean, one, certainly a stated policy of seeing the armistice as a temporary thing and working towards a different kind of a transformed peace and reconciliation and eventual reunification of the Korean Peninsula. But also, secondly, and of course, this is what's taken up so much of the bandwidth in terms of U.S. Paying attention to North Korea over the last 25 years, and that's its nuclear weapons program, which, notwithstanding the continued efforts of successive American presidents, Democratic and Republican, whether through diplomacy, pressure, sanctions, negotiations, threats of war, North Korea has been undeterred in terms of developing its program. And we now have a situation much, much more challenging than we had even 10 years ago or 5 years ago, but certainly 10 or 11 years ago when I was first here in 2006, in that North Korea has now established in its own mind that it is a nuclear weapons power state. That's not something I think the United States or the international community is ready or will be ready to acquiesce in, but it is a fact that they have a stockpile of nuclear weapons, and they have an increasingly able variety of means, I'm talking about missiles, to deliver them to a range of targets. So if you put in all that context, there's a lot of unfinished business when it comes to peace, reconciliation, and denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. And I'm not going to get to a lot of that, but I'll say a little bit more. But now I want to spend a few minutes again on specifically on the South Korean journey, because it gives me a chance to do something I've been wanting to do. And that is, tonight I also have, in addition to some friends here from, well, they're all from Harvard, many from Harvard, but some of my Peace Corps Sunbae, my seniors, so I have to be very, my seniors. I've a couple of them are here have written chapters for a book that I have not yet written my chapter for, but it's about how the Peace Corps Korea and those who were in it, especially my Sunday, were part of then building the Korean studies programs in the United States in the early years. But I've noted that what everyone does is write with great passion and verve about how Korea, what they saw in South Korea and how it kind of shaped their lives. And I get tired of talking about my own time in the 70s, in rural Korea. I don't really get tired of it, but I was really moved, and Carter Eckert, Professor Eckert, has an essay. He was assigned to Seoul. He went there. Where's Carter? Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there. You went in 1969, I think. I didn't go till 75. By the time I went in 75, the political situation had gotten so much starker that they didn't let people live in Seoul because they would just get in trouble, that being Peace Corps volunteers, because of the level of political unrest. So we were all there was a rustification program, right? And we all went, which is great. We went to the countryside, and I was initially in Chungcheongnam-do, which someone recently told me was like the Missouri of Korea, or in a political sense. But Carter was in Seoul. But I'm going to read you a little bit of what Carter wrote, because I think to think about South Korea, and there's this whole sort of cliched, frankly, language we use, but it's kind of shorthand too, but you've given me a generous amount of time to talk, so I want to get beyond sort of, the miracle on the Han, and, they were poor, now they're rich, and, isn't that wonderful kind of thing. It is wonderful, but it feels very real, and reading Carter's essay reminded me of how real it was. So Carter wrote that in 1969, the South Korea I encountered as a Peace Corps volunteer was a very different place from today. Seoul had not expanded much beyond its old colonial contours, and today's affluent Gangnam area south of the Han River, made famous by the South Korean singer Psy, existed largely as paddy fields. I remember that. most streets of the city were still unpaved. And actually the photo exhibition out there someplace, I mean, not too much different from what we saw, quite lovely. Seoul was not only small in the 1970s, it was poor, and the poverty was palpable. GDP per capita income was still less than $300 in 1970, while today it is more than 100 times that. It still had a kind of post-war feel about it. Beggars were everywhere. Street urchins, barefoot or wearing the cheap rubber shoes, gomushin, were also ubiquitous, running after pedestrians with their wares, usually gum or candy, especially enthusiastic and persistent if their quarry was a foreigner, whom they all invariably called 미국 사람, repeatedly, American. Carter describes what I also vividly remember, and not just in black and white photos, a chromatic pattern of black and gray, drab buildings on often treeless streets, drab in the suits of hurrying salarymen, perhaps wearing the only suit they owned, and in the uniforms worn by gaggles of middle school and high school students, another residue of the colonial era. At night, the city became even darker. Electricity was expensive, and the urban neon flash and glitter of today's Seoul was still nearly 2 decades in the future. As one moved from the center of the city to the suburbs, the darker it became, with single bulbs or even kerosene or candles providing the only illumination. In fact, the only time, Carter says, I ever saw a brightly lit Seoul in the entire time I lived there from 1969 to 1977 was in the early 1970s when a North Korean Red Cross delegation made an unprecedented visit to the city and the Park Chung-hee government ordered all the buildings leave their lights on at night as a sign to the north of the South's economic growth and prosperity. So I got to Korea, as I said, 1975. By that time, to the extent that you can trust GDP per capita figures, which is probably not much, but it had doubled. It was 600. And South Koreans were very proud of the fact that it seemed it was inching ahead of the North. The lines were beginning to cross. And I was in a deforested, very different from the countryside today, stark, but very beautiful landscape. And I too saw life changing. You were there longer, but in 2 years you would see, and I really informed as I went elsewhere, I mean, how you thought about how people's lives changed. Certainly within an authoritarian regime where you knew you had to stay out of politics, and the countryside, most people did, but they wanted something better for their children and they thought they could get it through education, a lot of pressure on the teachers, through sacrifice, through hard work. So I don't see a miracle, but I see a real determination to move forward, and extraordinary in slow ways, but very measurable ways, success. Certainly, suddenly some people had bicycles and didn't before. Bicycles are important to me. I got a bicycle. You could buy banana uyu at the corner store. There were TVs sprouting up. So it was a time of great change. But I was unprepared for going back in the 1980s, just for the next decade, then as a political officer, and diving deep into a completely transformed Korea, not so much economically. The economic growth was continuing and accelerating, but politically. Park Chung-hee had been assassinated. Chun Doo-hwan, another military officer, had come to power with blood on his hands. And Koreans were angry. You've written about this. They blamed the United States. I spent many years listening to Koreans, talking with Koreans about, and with very few sources of information because there wasn't much out there, about what had happened and how the U.S. viewed the democratization of Korea. Another story to be told another time, there actually is on YouTube. There's a lot of old footage from the 1980s that KBS has just put out. There's so much out there now. And I know because they interviewed me, because they found some old footage of me at Seoul National University meeting with the students who had sat in the American Cultural Center for 4 days and left when we promised we'd have a conversation with them, and they didn't have to stay for 4 days and we'd have the conversation. And anyway, a lot of them are leading politicians now, but it took me back a long way it took me back in a very vivid way to see this video from the 1980s of how the call for democratization in a real way, not just Chun Doo-hwan stepping down, but a legitimate election. Uri Sonro to elect our president was a call by the students, among many other calls, that gained such wide support that the tide could not be stopped. And I think in this case, the United States played not a decisive role, but I think a positive role, and one that, along with the Olympics coming in 1988, meant that Korea did take a decisive step from which it's never looked back, towards participatory democracy. And of course, then I went back my third time to Korea in 2008 as ambassador. I really felt like I'd seen how Korea's economic and political rise had led to this blossoming of Korea as a significant middle power on the world stage. And this was still in the early days of K-pop, so I don't know what we call it now, but it really is quite an extraordinary transformation, and one, as I said, I think the U.S. can take great satisfaction in, and certainly I think Koreans are more than generous about giving some credit to the United States and to the partnership there. Certainly, I think we can count it a partial success that North Korea has been deterred and contained, and that there has been relative peace and stability in Northeast Asia, which has also facilitated China's rise for the post-Korean War period. But as I mentioned earlier, North Korea clearly has, in its development and consolidation of a nuclear weapons arsenal and a missile delivery capability over a period of 3 decades, has been a source of, to put it lightly, great frustration to successive presidents in Washington who have, and again, this has kind of fallen to, for reasons we can talk about, I think Washington as the issue on which we engage North Korea. But I think there has been, and there continues to be, and I think the Trump administration also recognizes this, that denuclearization and peace are a process that need to go together. And by peace, I mean a process, I'm using a word from Northern Ireland, of reconciliation and addressing the unfinished business of the divide on the peninsula and the replacement of an armistice with some kind of more lasting peace. Now, as we've seen, easier said, it's not even that easy to say, but easier said than done. We've had a lot of dramatic developments over the last couple of years, and we can talk in more detail about that. But in a way, I think where we are now and where we've ended up is sadly not too much different from where we've been before, except it's kind of gotten harder. Again, because North Korea has this program, and it's harder, and there's not a precedent. Some people might point to, well, I'm not going to point to Libya because that's not but point to South Africa or possibly Ukraine as states that have possessed nuclear weapons and then gone through some kind of process of abandoning, or at least the program. But none of those are really quite right parallels. It's very difficult to do. We haven't seen it done, and I think that there certainly, in my view, there is a desire on the part of Kim Jong-un and the leadership in Pyongyang to try to have their cake and eat it too, and that is to keep this program but at the same time to develop its economy. I think that you also have a young leader in North Korea that would like to see, the North Koreans are proud people too, that would like to see North Korea have a better economy, have a better role in the international community. But if they can be tough and wait it out, maybe they can have both. And that's part of the tension, I think, that we're dealing with now. I do welcome, actually, the fact that the taboo, if you like, on top-level meetings is gone. I welcome the fact that Seoul has played a very important role in catalyzing the sort of summit diplomacy that did begin in 2018. I welcome the fact that lowered tensions dramatically over what they had been in 2017. Of course, to some extent, I think those tensions were fanned before they were suppressed. But nonetheless, we got into a better position. But now I think there is a real challenge, and again, within the context of both what I'm going to talk about next, kind of the geopolitical atmosphere and, if you like, politics here and in South Korea and elsewhere, that's going to make this very, very difficult, this being to get some kind of sustainable negotiation, sustainable peace and denuclearization process going in the coming months. But it doesn't mean you don't try, and I certainly do support the efforts of the Trump administration and the Moon administration to get something going. But the other thing I just wanted to touch on briefly was this, I guess what I'm going to call geopolitical flux. I actually went to a conference where it was something like, Korea in a time of geopolitical flux, and I thought, wow, that sounds like something, that on CNN they should be having, like advertisements for some kind of pill you can take for geopolitical flux. But we all kind of walk around. And I think, and how does that look from the Korean Peninsula? I'm going to kind of focus on South Korea, but I think if you're on the Korean Peninsula, you're in Korea. And Korea is the classic kind of case of, they used to call themselves the shrimp among whales, the victim of geopolitical great power competition. You don't have to go back too far. You can go back really far if you want, but the Sino-Japanese War, of which Korea was caught in the middle, the Russo-Japanese War and the resultant annexation of Korea by Japan, the division of Korea at the end and the beginning of the Cold War. This is not a misplaced sense of victimhood. It's a tough neighborhood to survive and thrive in, and one of the geniuses of the Korean people, I think, historically, has been the ability to do that against all odds. But I think we're in one of these times there where they're understandably worried, and we're all worried. And I go to a lot of conferences too where we talk about the U.S.-China, the most important bilateral relationship in the world now. Where is it going? And I did listen with great interest to Kevin Rudd's, the former Prime Minister Rudd's lecture last year, thanks to the wonders of YouTube, where he gave a talk on Xi Jinping's changing worldview. I actually had a chance, kind of a distance to, I was still working as official in Washington in 2012 when Xi Jinping came for his visit to Washington. It's kind of a tradition that the successor leader in China, before they take on the formal position, they come and they get all the high-level meetings, but it doesn't have to be like a formal summit, so it's a little more informal. And I think people really thought when 2012, he's a younger leader. He made a big point of saying he'd visited I think it was Iowa and stayed with a farm family and going back to see them, and that there was clearly a very impressive man, that this was a relationship that could be built upon. But I think that the sense now is obviously much more pessimistic about the direction that China is going in and the kind of friction that that's causing in the U.S.-China relationship. And I'll get to the U.S. too. But I thought Kevin Rudd's lecture was very impressive. It's been a long time since someone had explained dialectical materialism to me, and I still don't quite understand it, but it was really good. But I thought what he did have to say about Xi Jinping's changing worldview is the kind of distilled thing that, frankly, I think we need to have more in our conversations in Korea and with Koreans. Again, we do get a little bit siloed, and we kind of say, oh, the China thing, but we don't really kind of then, let's see what our shared understanding, because Koreans have their own relationship, obviously, with China, a very long and deep one. But I think he's right, Kevin Rudd, in saying that he sees, and I think this is generally accepted now, but I like the fact that he said he was going around talking to political leaders and senior leaders about this. He calls it a profound qualitative change in China's worldview under Xi Jinping. A new worldview that no longer accepts, passively or otherwise, American global or regional hegemony as consistent with Chinese national identity, political ideology, or long-term core national interests. That's, I think that's right, but we have to kind of let that sink in. And also a worldview that basically, he says in more polite language, that has concluded that the U.S. is in a period of deep transition. Some people would say decline or temporary decline, but deep transition, and this presents China with a strategic opportunity to bring about some changes to this order. And within this changed world order, as Xi sees it, an intent to craft a regional order in East Asia where Chinese interests are accorded primary consideration by neighboring states. Primary consideration. Now, we've seen a little bit of this already in South Korea when China turns to South Korea and says, you need to give primary consideration. They may not say primary, but consideration certainly to our core interests. It puts South Korea in a very difficult, as an ally of the United States, at having its own interests in a very difficult position. And we've seen under Xi Jinping, China ready to really play hardball to bring some pressure on South Korea. In fact, in recent years, I mean, some would argue that China's sanctions on South Korea have been more vigorous and in some ways more successful than China's sanctions on North Korea. I mean, I wouldn't say they've been successful in bringing South Korea to heel, but they've certainly been successful in causing the South Korean economy and the body politic to suffer some really serious damage and pressure. So that's the one side, and of course, the other side is the sense that the U.S. worldview is changing. And I think an uncertainty about, and I'm sure there are many views in this room, about whether or not the sort of rejection explicitly by President Trump, more in what he says sometimes than what is still in the official language of the U.S. government, but certainly in his tweets and in his own pronouncements and his speeches, a real rejection of what I was talking about earlier, the international rules-based order. That's not his language. And if I want to recommend one book to read about this is Bob Woodward, the Washington Post journalist, wrote a book called Fear, right, in which he did his kind of classic Woodward thing of talking to a lot of people in the administration, and nobody really seems to challenge what he says. I mean, but I mention it because I knew when it came out that, like, it starts off with an anecdote where on President Trump's desk there's a letter. In fact, he even has a copy of the letter in the book that for him to sign, where he's writing to the president of South Korea saying, "I hereby announce I'm going to withdraw from the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Thank you very much." And someone else, no longer working in the administration, kind of sneaks in and takes it out so that he can't see it and he can't sign it. But that's just one example, this book, and the reason I mention it is if you give it what we call, there's something in Washington they call the Washington Read, right, when a Washington book comes out, right, you know what that is? Where you walk into the bookstore, if anybody goes to a bookstore anymore, what Cambridge you do, and you pick it up, you immediately go to the index and you look for your own name, and then you look for the name of your friends, and I'm not in it, but, and then you decide if you're going to read it or not, or at least you read it, but so that's the Washington Read. But I would say I gave it the Korea read. And guess what? So did people in Korea. I'm sure in North Korea, but they certainly did in South Korea. And I know that because I was at a conference. It sounds like all I do is go to conferences. That's true. But I was at a conference in Seoul about 2 months ago where Bob Woodward was there being interviewed by the translator of the book. Because if you open up Fear and you look in the index, there's about 2 pages, literally, of references to South Korea and North Korea. So it's the fire and fury stuff, it's the North Korea stuff, but it's also the trade things, it's the alliance, it's the scenes where President Trump is taken to the Pentagon by all of his senior staff who are finally going to explain to him once and for all why alliances are to the benefit of the United States and how they work, and let's just say it goes very badly. So there's a lot in there. That's point one. And point two, since I'm trying to talk about maybe the world as it looks from the Korean Peninsula, Koreans are good students. I don't want to make stereotypes here. They've read this book. They've translated it. It's got to create, notwithstanding the reassurances that do come, the reassurances I think that are there, I'll get it from the institutionalization of our relationship, the broad and deep nature of it, it's very disconcerting. And, if you are in that position, you do have to start thinking about what is the plan B? How do we approach this? How do we handle it? I will say I think that South Korea, for example, on the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, handled it extremely well. And you may recall that the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which, at some point, I mean, this would, President Trump referred to as, the worst trade deal ever, but there's been a lot of worse trade deals ever. But it was renegotiated and ratified and is now set. It doesn't mean that there aren't still a lot of trade challenges for South Korea because, of course, there's not just the bilateral trade relationship. There's South Korea's vulnerability to a global trading system, which is in great flux. And, in this case, I mean, South Korea is a little bit, to kind of mix my metaphors, the canary in the mine as the most trade-dependent economy for a country of that size. I think Singapore would be counted as more trade dependent, but as a kind of not a city-state, but kind of a proper, if you like, country. South Korea is trade dependent. And so the ripples there are more than ripples, they're like tidal waves at times from trade policies that may be aimed at some objectives that the South Koreans would certainly sign up for in terms of addressing some of China's trading and IPR practices and so on and so forth. But this very bilateral approach, this very non-consultative approach that I think the administration has taken to this has also created a lot of uncertainty and discomfort for South Korea. And then you have, as also within the context of this geostrategic flux, if you like, the role of alliances themselves. And again, I'm going to end here in a minute with a pretty optimistic note, I think, about alliances, because I have seen them go through a lot of thick and thin, and I do have some confidence in in where we're going to come out, I think. But certain things that to date have always been points of, if you like, tough negotiation, some friction in the alliance loom much larger and become more unpredictable. What am I talking about? Well, I mean, the headlines, if you look at the Korean newspapers today, would be the ongoing negotiation on what percentage, how much Korea is going to pay, how much South Korea is going to pay to keep U.S. troops there. There's been, Korea has for some decades had something called a negotiation with the United States called a Special Measures Agreement, SMA, which is a formula where every year they pay a little bit more for the costs associated with U.S. troops deployed in South Korea. Again, President Trump has, not only with South Korea, but they're kind of the canary in the mine here for a number of reasons, taken that and said it's grossly one-sided and it's going to change. And the demand that's out there in a very public way is that by the end of the year, the expectation is a 5 times increase from something under a little bit under $1 billion a year to $5 billion a year. That's a challenge politically for South Korea as well as economically, and does begin to cause, I think, traditional, very strong support for the alliance to be questioned in some corners. So I think this is something we're going to have to watch over the next certainly few months. So I have a lot of polling data, but I'm going to skip most of it. But and I haven't gotten, but maybe we can get to it if we want to, when we have a discussion, to Korea-Japan relations, which also is a part of, I think, geopolitical flux and the challenges of nationalism in various forms and kind of populism. This is not confined, I think, to the U.S. But on this issue of China and the U.S., the South Korean, in a poll just a week ago, 81% said they were dissatisfied with China's global role. 71% were dissatisfied with the U.S. global role, global leadership. So pretty uncertain about both. And I don't think you would have seen those kinds of figures even a few years ago. So I have one other observation and then a little bit of a wrap up. And this is again about South Korea before I do wrap up. Have any of you seen Parasite? Yeah, Bong Joon-ho, right? So I really liked it, and I'm a big Bong Joon-ho fan. I also was really moved, as only an old-time kind of Korea person could be, by seeing Bong Joon-ho and the star of many of his movies. I like all of his movies. Song Kang-ho in France, accepting the Cannes Top Award. And I just thought, it's like to see him making an acceptance speech in Korean for this Korean language movie, and in France, it's translated. It was just such a sense of, again, Korea having arrived. And when I, think about the blossoming of Korea, all this creativity, all this dynamism, for which you do need political freedom as well as economic prosperity, and that has been the magic secret sauce, I think, of Korea, along with its own extraordinary history and culture. It just sends chills up my spine. I think it's fabulous. But you look at that movie itself when you talk about unfinished business, and not only that, but for any of you who are spending any time in Korea or talking to South Koreans, or maybe you are. A lot of South Koreans, especially young people, they sort of feel like the bloom is off the mugunghwa, right? It's a rather dark picture of what life is like in South Korea and in the world now. And what are the issues? Income inequality, the sense that the path of upward mobility has become too steep or even blocked, overpowerful big businesses, the intense competition, especially in education, but that then leads not to the sort of upward mobility and opportunities that would, skepticism and cynicism about political leadership, about their own democratic institutions. It all sounds kind of familiar, right? It's a malaise I think that I certainly think we can see here as well. In fact, I write a column for the Jungang Ilbo once a month, right? And I wrote a column. It was a little bit about the I hope this is not too sensitive at Harvard. The admissions scandals, right? And that playing out. And but my title for the column was "America is becoming more like Korea." This kind of scramble for and the comments underneath, I said, a lot of people wrote and said, "Oh, we're so sorry. Korea is really awful. We're really, really sorry that you're becoming like us." But it did kind of make me think, and I don't want to make light of it, because I think we are kind of in this together. And when you're in the business of diplomacy or talking about the alliance, it is an alliance that I believe continues to be based on shared interest, shared values, shared sacrifice, shared history, all of that. But it's also based on shared problems and kind of figuring those out. And you can also get into things like climate change. And we are natural partners. We can be natural partners in so many of those areas. And Korea, yes, on the map of Asia, it always looks a little small there, is a significant middle power, more important and more powerful, of course, because of its geographical position, but also because of the energy and the commitment of its people, and because we do have all of these, I think, shared experiences and values. So I know you may have heard the expression that the U.S. South Korea alliance is the linchpin of stability in Northeast Asia. Or maybe you haven't. Maybe in too many government circles. And the U.S.-Japan relationship is the cornerstone. Okay, we have to be really clear about that. There's a lot of, and if any of that changes, then there's the people notice. But the linchpin. And I think though I'd have to say yes, that linchpin is under some strain, but it's absolutely essential to achieving denuclearization, reconciliation, peace on the Korean Peninsula. But it's not just because we need it. I think it is all going to hold because of what I just mentioned. We share so much. And I think what really underpins what we share is a sense of values that I don't think, for all of the wonderful experiences I think that we had in Korea as Peace Corps volunteers 30 or 40 years ago, was not true in the same way. There's a much deeper sense of shared values. So I used to get a little tired sometimes, I have to say, as in my official role, don't tell anybody from the military this, but the respective militaries, when they would finish a gathering, they'd always say, "Kachi kapshida," which means let's go together. And it's very nice, that's fine, especially as a kind of a drinking thing, kachi kapshida. We learned that a long time ago. But I was kind of thinking, because I am kind of... I was a goodwill ambassador. It was actually, the title was in Korean, it was the Protector of Hangul. And I said, actually, I had to get and give a speech in Korean. I said, you really don't realize I'm actually a destroyer of the Korean language. But so I've kind of destroyed this kachikapshida a little bit by saying it's the only way a foreigner would think this way. The word in Korean for values is kachi. Yeah, I'm sorry if my... So I decided what we really need to say is, 같은 가치 바탕으로 같이 갑시다. If we're going to go forward together, it's got to be on the basis of shared values. And on that, I think we can survive this flux and build the kind of cooperation that we are going to need for what I think will be, if we're lucky, a slow process of transformation on the Korean Peninsula. But I think that's the only path ahead of us. So thank you very much. And again, it's really a pleasure to be here. Okay.
We'll join you over here for the
Flowers.
help you with the,
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much for that very personal and interesting reflection on Korea and U.S. relations. We now have plenty of time for some questions from the audience, so we'll now open the floor to you all. And so please raise your hand and identify who you are, and we'll field the questions from here.
Thanks. James, first of all, what responsibility does a previous U.S. administration bear for not fulfilling agreements within the nuclear agreement? Not that takes the weapons away, but what significance would you give to the failure to carry out the U.S. government's side of the agreement? And secondly, you touched on Japan. I think it was Mr. Overholt recently talking about how Japan really, at least the current government, aren't particularly hospitable to negotiated peace on the Korean Peninsula. And so could you talk a little bit about that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, with respect to previous agreements involving the United States and North Korea, there have been several. The graveyard is kind of littered with them. Briefly, three I would mention is one, and I think it's maybe the one you're referring to, is the agreed framework of the 1990s. This was one, again, before North Korea had even tested nuclear weapons, but had a enrichment site, had some missile development, but this specifically addressed the enrichment. Again, I wish this is a time when I wish we had Ambassador Bosworth here, because he worked very hard on that. And one of the things I remember him saying is that in American political terms, the agreed framework was an orphan at birth. It did not have a lot of political support in the United States. It was under the Clinton administration. It was right before a midterm election when the Republicans took control of the Congress. They had the purse strings. So there was weak political support. So this was a real issue. That said, I think it's also well established that the North Koreans were hedging their bets, as they often do, and they were continuing to, or at least in a quiet way, beginning to develop some alternate routes. They were abiding by the agreement, but they were beginning this program of the alternate route to a bomb through uranium. And when the Bush administration came to power, they focused on that and walked away from the agreement. So I think that one. When it comes to the six-party talks, maybe I'm a little more. I was involved in that. That was the second term of the Bush administration. It was probably a little late in the day for the Bush administration, but I think the joint statement was a good statement of principles. We just never got far enough with it. And again, some political changes in think about democracies. We have elections, so does Seoul. But there were also issues in North Korea. Kim Jong-il got very ill, and unfortunately, we didn't get very far enough. It broke really over the issue of verification and what the North Koreans considered to be far too intrusive verification. And then the final agreement I would mention is this is more than you wanted probably, is the Leap Day Agreement, which was negotiated during the Obama administration. And within days of that agreement, a much more limited agreement, which had to do with some delivery of some humanitarian aid and food aid, the North Koreans conducted a missile test, which they labeled as a satellite launch, but was clearly prohibited by the UN Security Council resolutions, in which the U.S. took as a sign of bad faith, and that broke down within days of signing. On the issue of Japan and Japan's attitudes, thank you. One thing I would have emphasized, and I'm glad I can now, is on the sort of North Korean diplomacy. One area that I think needs some more work, as difficult as it is right now, given the geopolitical situation, is kind of a regional approach. Japan does matter. China matters. China's not going to be satisfied with getting after-action briefings on what the U.S. did with North Korea. And as we've seen, Kim Jong-un understands that he needs to he's very mindful of the Chinese flank as well. We need to find a way, in a kind of a very general way, a diplomatic effort, an effort to pressure North Korea. It needs to be about more than just everyone's going to abide by the sanctions, although it's very important. They also need to be, there for the takeoff and there for the landing of a diplomatic approach. Japan itself obviously has, particular issues that are important to it politically. One, of course, has to do with the unresolved issue of accounting for the Japanese abductees who were taken to the north and have still not been accounted for. And I think that certainly they look at, and understandably, changes on the Korean Peninsula is directly affecting their security. So I think that their engagement on this issue obviously is very sensitive for a variety of historical reasons and political reasons, but I think it's also an area where the U.S. and its own alliance relationship, and South Korea, if it can get, South Korea and Japan can get back on a better place, that we need to be in touch about, both in terms of deterring North Korea while it has this threat, but also in terms of the way forward.
Yes, interestingly, just 2 weeks ago, we had a panel discussion here on populist nationalism in Korea and Japan with Gi-wook-shin, this article that he's written, and Professor Eckhart and Andy Gordon engaging in that conversation. So a lot of these issues came up quite starkly in that conversation. So.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting article, and because I think there's a kind of a shorthand that people use to talk about why is why is there so much animosity? Between Japan and South Korea, it's history, and then sometimes the advice from some Americans can be just, put the history behind you or deal with another channel or something. But I have to, from my time in the Balkans and Northern Ireland, I have to say, actually, in our own country, history is never really over, right? And two. South Korea and Japan are not unique in finding these to be stumbling blocks. Every time I used to land in Belfast, well, not every time. Occasionally, there'd be some wag next to me who'd lean over and say, "You're now landing in Belfast. Set your clock back 400 years." Churchill famously said about the Balkans, "The Balkans produce more history than they can consume." And I'm not trying to make light of this, but they're real obstacles, and they need to be addressed. But I think that Professor Shin's insight that part of the issue is, I may not be paraphrasing him right, but as I take away from it, that you do have to look, and it's such a loaded word in a way, at nationalism, and the way that the modern Korean national identity was shaped by the struggle against Japan, by the experience of Japan, and how that makes it even more complicated. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah.
You were right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, please, of course, you're.
Well, since I'm here, I don't know why I'm sitting here, but since I'm here, I'd like to ask a question about today's headline, in Korean newspaper about cost sharing, right? About right now it's about 30,000 troops stationed
about 28,000 troops, yeah.
Right. So, what's the truth about that? In terms of dollar amount, I guess U.S. pays a lot, but then you have to ask the question. It's not just about the number and the money. So what's really behind this?
Yeah. Well, I think quite simply, Donald Trump is behind this. I think he sees this in a very, transactional way. No, I think he would say that too, This is not the approach that I'd say, our military takes. It's been a long-standing, just as an example, thing I heard from military officers over the years when it came to this kind of burden sharing. I would say, well, of course, we would not include the costs of what you actually pay our soldiers and their costs because we are not mercenaries. And it's a very important principle for the United States that we are doing this because it's in our mutual interests. But as I was kind of mentioning at the anecdote in the Woodward book, that clearly is something that our military establishment feels strongly about, and they haven't really persuaded the president of that. And he has a certain way, and we've seen it in trade deals too, right? Of put out a big number and then I guess kind of work it out. But but the political consequences of that are very challenging. So, I worry about this because there is a real deadline here. What the Korean contribution does pay for is, for example, the many Korean citizen employees who provide absolutely essential services to the U.S. military bases and establishments in South Korea. If the funding doesn't come by a certain time, in 2020, it's kind of like the government shutdown. They get laid off. Now, I'm sure there are ways. This is a government. You can kind of figure something out for a while, but there's actually a hard deadline there. But in terms of how you come up with a number, I just have to say, it's. I'm trying to think what you can compare it to. It just all depends. South Korea made a big investment in facilitating what was jointly agreed to be a very important, and I think it was very important, move to consolidate, a famous word, consolidate the U.S. military presence throughout South Korea in one large presence near Pyeongtaek, right, in what's called Camp Humphreys. So, about a couple hours, not even a couple hours now, everything, but, it was south of Seoul, southwest of Seoul. And move out of that area in Yongsan, which of course had been, I think, the Japanese Imperial Army, and then the U.S., but right in the middle of Seoul. So that finally has been done, along with consolidating other places, other little camps around the country that really hadn't changed since the Korean War, in this beautiful, huge, I'm told it's the largest U.S. military establishment outside the United States. I'm not sure if that's in terms of acreage or what, but it's really big. That cost, I hear $9 billion, $10 billion, or that's about how much the South Koreans put into it. That's a lot. That's not counted as part of the burden sharing, okay? But, a lot of other things are, but what do you count and what don't you? It's also very hard. The other thing to say about this burden sharing is Japan's is coming up, right? Well, Japan, there's a different calculation because Japan has a different kind of defense budget, different kind of defense profile, and then in Europe it's a different thing as well with NATO. A lot of the pressure from the United States, not only in this case from the Trump administration, but earlier administrations, was to get NATO allies to have larger defense budgets. Well, South Korea has a pretty big defense budget. One, because it has a real threat, and it's going up. So, how does that fit in there? So I think it's a negotiation I'm glad I'm not a part of.
Let's see. How about first Carter? Yeah, and then Dave.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Welcome.
Would you like my dramatic reading?
I did. Is this on? Yes. Okay, great. So I haven't read Woodward's book. I think I will now, hearing what you had to say about it. Speaking of President Trump, I think I disagree with almost everything that he has said and done, except one thing, and that is that he did, I think, finally break through the diplomatic impasse with North Korea, and I think that was important, and I think it was a good thing to do, and I was happy to hear you say that as well. What is going on right now? This is where I get puzzled. Obviously, there has to be a process that you mentioned. It has to take place below the presidential level, presumably in the State Department and in other areas. And we have people like Steve Biegun and others who are working on this. But what is the real stumbling block here that you see? Is it the echo chamber that we hear in Washington always about denuclearization first and everything else comes later? And something the North Koreans, I think, are never going to accept, so it's a non-starter to begin with. Or are there other things going on here? What exactly, as you see it, from your perspective, is the problem that the process, which is crucial, doesn't seem to be moving along, at least very fast?
Yeah, it is very hard to say. I mean, my own sense, and again, I don't want to pretend to have, very sensitive information. Of course, if I did have it, I wouldn't be able to share it. But, my own sense of the chronology is, you had Trump and Kim Jong-un meet in Singapore, issue a statement which was pretty vague and was widely regarded, and I would agree with this, as being, if you like, setting it out in a way that was most comfortable for the DPRK without a lot of specifics. But they had the meeting. That was the framework to go forward. You had an inter-Korean process that also made some progress, with Moon Jae-in having a couple of meetings with Kim Jong-un, a military agreement. I should actually mention that because of conventional confidence building. You know, we get so focused on the nuclear. I mean, there's all that stuff at the DMZ, right? There's all the conventional forces, and so an agreement in September of last year with some modest steps, but important steps of confidence building, and that sort of began. But in Hanoi, famously, and Kim Jong-un took the train down to Hanoi and met with President Trump. Obviously, I think that was really unfortunate. I don't think you should have a summit if it's really going to blow up like that. And I think recovering from that, without going into the details, is taking some time. So to what extent is Kim Jong-un, did he lose face because he went all the way there and came back with nothing? But I think from the point of view of Washington, and this was, I mean, Trump made this rather extraordinary gesture of going to Panmunjom, right? And I thought we'd never say, and walking across to the North Korean side, and Moon Jae-in there too, and kind of having symbolic, let's get back together. And then it still took some time before they had this working level meeting, so-called working level meeting. Everything below president now is working level. Yeah. But pretty high-level meeting, and in Stockholm, and after a day of what I think the Americans thought and said publicly were pretty reasonable talks, the North Koreans got up and said, no, we don't like this, we're walking out. So it seemed to be a little bit sort of, that's what they felt they needed to do. Are they just positioning themselves? The optimists would say they're positioning themselves to go in for something. I think there is a recognition on the U.S. side that this is going to be an iterative process, that there are. But I think there's also a little bit of frustration of kind of the, not getting in a position where you're negotiating with yourself, trying to figure out what the North Koreans want. Is it sanctions relief? Sometimes is it security guarantees? But there's a menu of options, and they have not gotten a lot of traction in figuring out what those are. So, from Washington's point of view, I think I do think that they're quite sincere in saying they would like the North Koreans to get back to the table. Clearly, the South Koreans would like to see that too, and that they're ready to make some deals, and they will be step by step, I think. But I think there is still a real question is Kim Jong-un strengthening his position by, doing these missile tests that kind of walk up to a line that he, kind of perceives even, or not. And the other thing I guess to mention is he's declared this deadline at the end of the year. The U.S. has to change its attitude by the end of the year, or else. So, or else what? I don't know. So if anybody else has an idea, let me know. So that's a pretty muddled answer, but I think it's a pretty muddled kind of situation. From a point of view of sitting in the gallery, throwing popcorn at the people who are doing this, I don't fault the Trump administration. I think they've learned some lessons. They've tried to push this forward. As I mentioned, I do think there has to be a regional element at some point. It's very hard right now getting everything else to kind of get the Chinese really involved. And the other thing I really don't understand, and maybe some South Koreans if they're here would have it, I don't understand why the North Koreans are being so nasty to the South Koreans right now. But maybe they want to blame them for the breakdown in Hanoi, or they just want to keep the pressure on. But it's hard. It's hard to be optimistic, but I think that the Trump administration, certainly President Trump doesn't want to see a return, I don't think, to real tensions. He does see this as an accomplishment and may over-egg the pudding a little bit in terms of what he accomplished, but that's politics, that's okay. But I don't think he wants to see a crisis. And, heaven knows how. I mean, if you're sitting in Pyongyang, how do you figure out our politics?
I think Professor McCann? There's a...
David McCann, and I used to teach Korean literature, and
I remember with great fondness a gathering at the ambassador's residence a few years ago where she hosted a group of students from some of the Korean academies in a Shijo contest. And I just thought that was a great step forward.
Thanks to you. That was fantastic.
Well, you were the one. And Ann and I were just back in Korea for a Peace Corps revisit and then another week of meetings. And there's a tremendous amount of interest now in the Shijo.
Oh,
And there's a new Shijo monument stone that was dedicated while we were there and a number of other things going on. And I just wondered, are there any things of that sort in the plans and the activities and the exchanges that are going on now that you're aware of with Korea in its reach out to the world?
yeah, especially with South Korea.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I believe North Korea has no interest in the Shijo at all, but
Yeah,
in
yeah.
South
I mean,
Korea,
I'd
it's
love
very-
to see some cultural exchanges. You know, at the kind of official level, there probably are. I'm not so aware of them, but certainly, maybe in the job I have now and just kind of being out and about. I mean, it is really quite wonderful. This is one of and extraordinary to see just how much is kind of organically happening, because there is so much interest now in Korean language, Korean culture, Korean music, you name it. I sort of play a game with myself of kind of one degree of separation from something having to do with Korean. We actually have a little newsletter we do at the Korea Economic Institute where we try to identify these things. Like, what am I talking about? There's an example. I'm taking your question a little lightly, but yeah, I think there's a lot happening, but more outside government channels, which is fine, than in. So I don't know if I say. Can I say this in Boston? The Washington Nationals won the World Series. I don't know if you got that news. and their theme song became this song called Baby Shark.
Yeah.
The name of the song is actually Agi Sanga, right? Agi Sangu. Sorry, didn't say, yeah, Baby Shark. So, and the whole thing that went viral was actually by a Korean company. So now there's actually kind of a copyright dispute about whether or not it was really a Korean song first or an English-American song, camp song first. But that's an example of the 1 degree from Korea and everything now, which wouldn't have been the case some years ago, right?
Yeah.
But there's a Korean language camp. Some of you may be familiar with Concordia language camps. They're quite well known, right? Their Korean program now is oversubscribed by within the first few days, and fewer and fewer. Now there's no so-called heritage speakers, and more people from all across the United States who've gotten interested in Korea for a whole variety of reasons. And they received a year or so ago $5 million from a Korean businessman to build a Korean village there. Something which, say, none of the other Asian languages have. So there is this sense of kind of just things happening kind of organically, and I think that we can really, again, kind of build to I think, help us get through some of the rough spots that we're in and may still lie ahead. But yeah, that Shijo was really fun. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Myung-Kyu Park from Seoul
Nice to
National
see
University.
you.
Nice to meet you here. I really enjoyed your presentation. It seems to me that you try to locate the U.S. Korea 1 century history in the context of some kind of civilization process rather than political or just economic. You pushed lots of sharing values and very co-experience between two countries. Now, how benefit that had been not only to the United States but also to South Korea. I totally agree with you. And in the last part, you stressed some kind of core value or sharing value for the further progress. What I'm trying to ask you is, in contemporary Korea, lots of people, particularly among the young generation, they feel some kind of, how to say, anomy in terms of value orientation. What do you think is the most important value in United States as well as in Korea, particularly in Korea? For example, many Korean people have been educated, liberalism, individualism, market principle, sometimes internationalism, or humanism. Usually those values were linked to the image of the United States. Actually, that was very positive and really positive role it had done. But as you maybe know, many people are suffering from whether just liberalism or individualism or liberal democracy market principle can be the next standard of value, not only in Korea but also in the international community now. So from your perspective, based on your highly experience in politics and economics, how do you suggest to the young generations of Korean people, please think about this value. Please more highlight to those values for the future. So could you elaborate something about that?
I appreciate that. I mean, it's difficult because I think frankly, the United States is in a little bit of a crisis of confidence too in its own values, so in a way, kind of my point is, we shouldn't just sort of commiserate together, but we really should think about this. I mean, I think the issue of a shared value. I actually think this pretty deeply seated notion of egalitarianism, right, and of kind of individual choice. I mean, I know that I'm with a lot of scholars here, so I have to be careful. But I mean, as I understand Korea's historical culture, you had kind of the Neo-Confucian tradition, which is very hierarchical, very stratified, but sort of under, the kind of beating heart of Korea under that, and maybe also influenced by its 20th century and post-colonial experience, is a really deep sense of, hey, I'm just as good as you are, and if I work hard and I can get ahead. That's very deeply felt in the United States too, but there's also a lot of, especially young Americans, who think that's ridiculous. I mean, I talk to a lot of young people who say, that may have been true for you, but it's not for me, What's the expression? Oh, you boomer, I mean, you don't know. So there's sort of there's a shared problem. I think that we both really treasure our self-image as, just loving our democracies. And yet we don't have a lot of confidence in them and our institutions in some ways. So it's almost like, I think we need to sort of, whether it's in the academy or, however we do this, it just is see that even though we're very, very different countries, we are in this kind of, this somewhat, I don't want to call it existential, but this bit of a crisis of confidence now, and kind of figure it out together, and just kind of by doing that might help a little bit. I also just think that and this is, I think, something we've seen over the years, and we talked about, get back to kind of government speak of the alliance itself. Even as its kind of core function, like was the military alliance to protect and defend, the Republic of Korea, to ensure stability. We really did find there's a lot of places where we have complementary approaches, and again, climate change is not a terribly good one to use right now, given the position of the Trump administration. But there are states who want to work on it. And I think climate change is one where, again, we have, sort of highly educated, especially Korea, populace has a lot of skills where we can find areas to work together. And, again, our experience has been when we do that, we're pretty successful. So it's just kind of on that sort of basis that I think we need to try to go forward. But no, I think you're absolutely right. I think, and what you describe in Korea is something I also worry about in this country.
So I think we only have time, I think, for one more question, and then the conversation can be carried on out in the concourse with our reception. I think the next gentleman in the back there, I think, had his hand up for a little bit here, so, and then I think we'll make the move.
So for a country that's achieved so much in such a remarkably short period, do you have an explanation or an understanding of what spawned the phrase Hell Joseon, and connected to that, the plummeting birth and marriage rates in South Korea?
Right. Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about just now, and to the movie Parasite. You know? And to a lot of other movies you can watch. I mean, there's another one called Burning, if you've seen it. It's a really good movie too. But I think that is trying to express, right? I went to kind of Hellchosun. I mean, this sense that one of the challenges of South Korea's rapid and remarkable transformation is that expectations are just sky high, and competition is so great. And in this sense, unlike the United States, it still is such a highly centralized sort of system, you know, and in some ways, you know, so conformist that, you know, once you had the economic, through great sacrifice, the economic ability to send not just your oldest son, but, you know, your daughter as well and others to college, and not only to the provincial university, but to give them the wherewithal to study so that they could compete to go to Seoul National or the so-called Sky universities. The competition has just gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. And then when you come out the other end, even with that degree after all that, you've got to study, you know, like 4 more years if you want to take the exam to be a civil servant or a diplomat, or you have to fight for one of the very, very few little, you know, very, very few jobs in the major chaebol. But so there, I'm combining a lot of things there, but there's just that sense of the pyramid has gotten so much steeper. And I think that this is where the kind of mindset, and maybe this is something where the U.S. tried to be a little helpful. And actually, I think the Korean American community kind of defined success in broader ways. You know, that you don't have to be a lawyer or a, you know, professor, or a diplomat, you know, to be considered to be a successful person. You can have a food truck. You know, you can, you know, do some crazy, you know, painting or something, and you do see more of that. But even that, so that's some of the pressure that I think is in the Hellchosun. But it's real, and again, just given that, I think for those of you, and a lot of you have spent a lot of time in Korea, you feel it more there because of just the kind of hothouse feeling of the environment. And again, as you go back to, and it's like that so much change has happened so fast. It's I mean, when you get to be, you know, my age or some of our ages, there's been change everywhere, but it really is at just a different order of magnitude in South Korea, which is a fantastic thing. But I think there is kind of a collective mental pressure that the young people in particular feel.
It's sort of a permutation of the Churchillian phrase, never have so many or so much to so few. In this case, never have so many visits so quickly, so fast.
Yeah.
Well, great. Thank you very much. And we'd like to thank Ambassador Stevens once again for joining us for this Tsai lecture. We may not have been able to finish the story, but I personally feel as if I've sort of caught up with the narrative now and will better understand the next chapters that are certainly to come here in this ongoing developments and these relationships. So thank you very much for sharing your insights with us, and thank you all for coming, and please join us in the concourse for a reception. Thank you.